It's time for a story for all ages, so I invite you to come forward. In a row, very nice. Okay. In order to understand this story, you have to know what a weir is. Do any of you three gentlemen know what a weir is? A weir is like a net, and you can stretch it across a river and use it to catch fish. And this is the story of Elphin and the weir. A long time ago, in a kingdom by the sea, a faraway kingdom, there lived a king named Gwydno, and he was very lucky. And the reason for his luck was a river that ran through his kingdom to the sea. And every year, just once, on the evening of the next to the last day in April, that was April 29th, these large fish, they were salmon, would come from hundreds of miles in the ocean to the river, and they would swim up the river because it was time for them to go back to their birthplace. And there were so many thousands of them. Most of them swam through the river very easily, except King Gwydno had a weir across the river, and it caught a number of them. And that catch was so big that it fed his entire kingdom, and it left enough for the people to trade with neighboring kingdoms, so they were very rich. Now Gwydno had only one child, a son named Elphin. And Elphin was going to be king after Gwydno. But unlike his father, Elphin didn't seem very lucky at all. He didn't do very well in his studies. He wasn't that interested or good at sports, and he didn't seem to have any special talents. And Gwydno was afraid that his son would not be able to take care of himself when he grew up, or take care of the kingdom when he became king. So one year, just before Elphin really became a grown-up man, the king's counselors, the wisest men and women in the kingdom, advised him to send his son to the weir on the day of the great catch, because they thought that it might change his luck. So, on the next to the last day in April, on that evening, Elphin mounted his horse and he set off at a happy trot for the weir. But when he got there, there were no fish. The only thing he found was a leather bag, a soggy leather bag. And as he pulled that leather bag out of the weir, a voice came from the weir, and it said, "What a curse that you came here to spoil the spell that fills the weir. That worthless bag was meant for you, because like it, you're worthless too." And Elphin said, "How do you know it's worthless? Maybe there's a treasure inside it." And as he opened it, he saw the radiant forehead of a sleeping baby, the most beautiful baby anyone had ever seen. And he said, "Behold, Taliesin, I will call you Taliesin," because in his language, Taliesin meant radiant forehead. But he still didn't have any fish. He still didn't know how he was going to take care of himself, or how he was going to take care of the baby. And he was feeling very sad, because he thought that maybe that voice in the weir was right. His father, the counselors, the entire kingdom, all of them were depending on him, and he had failed. So maybe he was worthless. But there wasn't anything he could do about it. So he tucked the baby very gently in one arm, and very carefully he mounted his horse. And very slowly, because he didn't want to wake that baby up, he started for home. And then something amazing happened. Baby Taliesin sang to him. "Good, kind Elphin, don't be sad. Your luck isn't really bad. No fish ever caught in the weir is worth as much as you hold here. Although I am little, I can solve any riddle, for I know what the future brings, and you will be the very best of kings. And that was the first time Taliesin ever sang to comfort Elphin, who had saved him from the water. And it made Elphin very happy. Well, when he got home, his father asked him, "Did you catch a lot of fish?" And he said, "No, something even better, a bard." Do you know what a bard is?
A baby. No.
No, not quite, but that was good. That was good. I appreciate the effort. A bard is a great poet, a singer, a storyteller. In this case, I'd say a baby rapper. And his father looked at him and he said, "A bard? Oh, my son, that's not a bard. It's just a helpless baby. How can that helpless baby help you take care of yourself and the kingdom?" And I wonder if you can guess what happened then.
The baby sang to the king.
Yes, the baby sang to the king. Exactly. "Good King Gwydno, don't be sad. His luck isn't really bad. No fish ever caught in the weir is worth as much as he holds here. Although I am little, I can solve any riddle, for I know what the future brings, and he will be the very best of kings." And it was true. When people heard what had happened, they came from everywhere to congratulate Elphin on his good luck, and to praise him, and to hear Taliesin sing. And the whole kingdom prospered. That's it. Elphin and the weir. So it's time to sing you gentlemen out. This summer I heard a wonderful radio program titled "What's Your Story?" And I think the host, Dean Olsher, spoke for many of us when he said, "I feel that stories are so prevalent now that we are drowning in them and they have become their own distraction. And I want to escape from story because it seems to have invaded every part of our culture." And then just a couple of Tuesdays ago, I was at my quilt group, and as usual, at one point the conversation turned to TV shows. And as usual, when that happens, there's this special energy that charged the room. You probably have noticed this too. When people talk about movies and TV shows, everything seems to come alive. And these women were following so many TV shows and so many characters, I honestly don't know how they ever found the time. And then one of them, her name's Marilyn, picked up on that vibe in the room. And she said, "Have you ever wondered why these make-believe people mean so much to us? It's as if they were more real and important than people we actually know." And we all laughed in recognition. But that laugh bit into me because it brought back a question that has been nagging me for years. We are the most matter-of-fact, no-nonsense people ever. We know exactly how many board feet a giant redwood will yield. We know that it takes 4.4 million gallons of fresh water to frack a well. And when we want to, we can remove entire mountaintops to get at coal. So why do we, the most no-nonsense, matter-of-fact people ever, require so many fictions? Why? Why don't we ever seem to get enough? And recently I was rereading Jay Griffith's book, A Sideways Look at Time, and I stumbled on something that I think was a part of that answer. She attributes the worldwide popularity of cinema to a hunger for myth. And in her words, myths have always depended on a storyteller, Griffiths. That's what she says. And today, the camera takes that role. And it hit me. Wow, she's right. She's absolutely right. The prevalence of stories alone testifies to just how hungry we are. And you can see it everywhere, not just on TV or in movies. You see it in people who are playing The Sims, that life simulation game that they play online. And you can see it, you know, you're driving down the highway and this truck comes flashing past you and there's a bucolic scene pasted on the side of the truck and you see the rolling geometry of beautiful farmland and glowing colors. There's a peaceable kingdom of animals in the front. And all this is there to sell you the reassuring story that this is where your factory farmed food comes from. And you can see it in logos, those logos that we see everywhere, and their ubiquity inflates our image of businesses with kind of quasi-religious aura of power. I would say I'd put myth hunger just right up there, close to the hunger that we have for food. And I'm still wondering why, as a matter of fact, people, we need that. So I found a couple more clues in another book. This is Tor Nordstrander's The User Illusion. And he tells a fascinating story about a young man named Paul. Now this is complicated, so hang in there. For medical reasons, surgeons had to cut the connection between the hemispheres of Paul's brain. And scientists know from experience that in most people, when they have this surgery, this severs the conscious mind from the unconscious mind. And that's what it did to Paul. And later, when a neuroscientist named Michael Gazzaniga tested Paul, he was able to show him a type of composite picture that showed Paul's unconscious mind a snow scene, and it showed his conscious mind a chicken claw. Are you still there? Okay. He showed him a chicken claw. Okay. And then Gazzaniga gave him a stack of cards with pictures on it, with things like lawnmowers, toasters, hammers, apples, and asked him to pick out cards related to the composite. Paul picked out 2 cards. The first one was a chicken. So far, so good. But at this point, it starts to get spooky. The second one was a shovel. He picked a shovel even though he didn't know that he saw a snow scene. Right? Because that was what his unconscious mind processed. And if you think about it, even though he wasn't conscious of it, it still makes a weird kind of sense. Because part of him somewhere knew that he had seen a snow scene, picked the shovel, and the other part knew that it saw the chicken claw, picked the chicken. Okay. But the way Paul explained it did not make sense. When Gazzaniga asked him why he chose the chicken and the shovel without missing a beat, he said, the chicken goes with the chicken claw, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. Where did that come from? There's no chicken shed. It astonished Gazzaniga. And clearly, even though his conscious mind had no idea why he picked the shovel, it explained it anyway. And this told Gazzaniga that the conscious mind's, these are his words, cognitive system needed a theory and instantly supplied one that made sense, given the information that it had. Now others have replicated this experiment and they've gotten exactly the same results. So as Tor Nordstrander says, the conscious mind lies like crazy to create a coherent picture of something it does not understand in the slightest. So that should tell us that the conscious mind is not a rational mind. It's a rationalizing mind. It's a storyteller, a compulsive, convincing, often entertaining, and unreliable storyteller. And to make things worse, consciousness has a puny, tiny, minuscule bandwidth. This is what a German physiologist named Dietrich Trinker says about it. Only 1/1,000,000th of what our eyes see, our ears hear, and our other senses inform us about appears in consciousness. So while we can savor a ripe pear and delight when we stroke a baby's soft skin, and we can let the sunlight and breezes sifting through the yellow ginkgo leaves in autumn dazzle and enchant us. We simply cannot know them consciously with the intensity that we feel them. The world is an ocean. It's an ocean of information and sensation. And it meets and flows into the river of the unconscious. And consciousness, the storyteller, is but a little weir on that river that occasionally catches something and lets almost everything else slip through. Now, to compensate for this breathtaking handicap, the storyteller assembles a few bits of information, insignificant in themselves, into symbols that dip back into the unconscious and make our consciousness, our awareness, resonate with meaning and give us a felt sense of the world. As Tor Nordstrander says, symbols are the Trojan horses by which we smuggle bits into our consciousness. Again, symbols are the Trojan horses by which we smuggle bits into our consciousness. And that's what we live by, a network of symbols. In other words, myth. Whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, we live by myth. And at its best, you could characterize all of culture, its religions, its philosophies, its arts, and even its sciences as a Herculean effort to smuggle the most resonant bits into consciousness so that it can weave them together into stories worth believing. Okay. Even if you accept the concept of myth hunger, that still doesn't account for the staggering number of stories that inundate us. I'm prepared to bet that we have poured out more stories in a decade than the whole rest of humankind has since we started painting caves. And that brings us back to the earlier question: why do we, the most no-nonsense, matter-of-fact people ever, require so many fictions? Why? Well, I'd like you to remember that storyteller in the weir, the one that called Elphin worthless. That storyteller was cursing him. And I think that we are listening to a no-nonsense, matter-of-fact storyteller who is cursing us. Cursing us with a disenchanting myth. I would even call it an anti-myth that is killing off our felt sense of the world. The real world is anything but no-nonsense and matter-of-fact, and something inside us knows it. The real world generates flimsy butterflies that can migrate 2,000 miles, and ponderous elephants who weep for their dead. The real world steeps its most ordinary moments in wonder. And I think we're starved for connection to that, and we're struggling to restore our connection to that. Somewhere in that flood of stories, we hope to find real treasure, re-enchantment. And it's in the flow. Flow puts magic in the weir. Without it, the weir is nothing. Because it doesn't have the capacity to know enough. Because it will never know everything or get it right. Our consciousness will babble anything to us. So how do we keep it honest? We need to smuggle a Trojan horse inside it to promote active flow. And I believe that our seventh principle, interdependence, offers us just that. Interdependence reminds us to see things in relationships. Relationships link causes to effects. Relationships entail care and limits. Interdependence has to be our touchstone. Then, despite what the storyteller gets wrong, I think that the stories will be good enough. Myths and symbols run very deep. They invite archaeology and they lend themselves to reinterpretation. interpretation. The best ones seem inexhaustible, and I'd like to leave you with a couple of stories for all ages to illustrate it. The first is a Hindu story. Once, the Creator became separated into male and female, and the male wanted to mate with the female. But the female thought, how can he mate with me when he just created me out of himself? Come, let me hide. So she became a cow. But he became a bull, and he mated with her, and that's how cattle were born. So she became a mare, but he became a stallion, and he mated with her. So then she became a she-goat, but he became a he-goat, and he mated with her. And she became a ewe, and he became a ram, and he mated with her. And that's how all hoofed animals were born. Indeed, that's how he created all, whatever pairs there are, even down to the ants. Here's another story. This one comes from the Welsh Mabinogion. It tells about a sorceress named Ceridwen who had twins, a beautiful girl and a hideous boy. And to compensate him for his ugliness, she came up with a potion to give him wisdom and poetic inspiration. But only the first 3 drops of the potion could do that. The rest was poison. And because she had a lot of things to do, and this potion took a year and a day to brew, she set a blind old man named Morda the task of stoking the fire, while a young boy named Gwion Bach stirred it. Now it happened that after a year and a day, the first 3 drops of that potion spurted out onto Gwion Bach's thumb. And because it was hot and it burned him, he put his thumb in his mouth. He gained the wisdom and poetic inspiration that Ceridwen intended for her son. And because of it, he knew she was going to be very angry, so he fled. But Ceridwen chased him. And he used his newfound powers to turn himself into a hare, and he sped away from her. But she turned herself into a greyhound, and she ran after him. So he turned himself into a fish, and he jumped into the river. But she turned herself into an otter, and she swam after him. And finally he turned himself into a little bird, and he rose into the sky, but she turned herself into a hawk, and she followed him. So then, Gwion Bach turned himself into a single grain of corn. And she became a hen, and she found him, and she ate him. But the potion, the filter that she had concocted, protected him, and Ceridwen became pregnant. And because she knew that it was Gwion Bach that she carried, she resolved to kill him when he was born. Yet when she saw him, he was so beautiful that she couldn't do it. So instead, she sewed him inside a leather bag, and she threw it into the sea. And the tides and currents carried that leather bag all the way to a weir in Wales, where young Prince Elphin pulled it out. And when he opened that bag, he saw the beautiful forehead of a sleeping baby, the most beautiful baby anyone had ever seen. And he said, "Behold, Taliesin, I will call you Taliesin." Because in his language, that meant radiant forehead. And that is how Gwion Bach became the legendary bard and storyteller, Taliesin. I think you can see profound similarities in these 2 myths. Both share a hunt and metamorphosis, birth and rebirth, as a way to survive it. And to me, those themes imply the relatedness of all life. They assume connection, interdependence. Both say one thing can turn into another. All things are variations of each other. We are all variations of each other. And in them, I think we can also discern the familiar outline of something that many of us believe and hold sacred. The embryo of evolution. in which metamorphosis, birth and rebirth, emerges as a strategy to survive the hunt and confirms the relatedness of all life. One thing can turn into another. We are all variations of each other. Evolution distills a truth latent in those older stories. In all three, interdependence is the touchstone, the seed myth. And now it's our turn to nurture that seed, put it to new purpose, and pass it on for other incarnations. A little music. We've come to the time of the service for a spoken and then a silent meditation. And before we begin, you may want to sit up straight in your seat. Rest your feet flat on the floor. Put your hands comfortably in your lap. Relax your breathing. You may want to close your eyes. As the year draws down to its darkest darkness, even indoors the cold creeps up our legs and stiffens our knuckles. Outside, fewer and fewer leaves straggle on the trees. The color has gone out of those that have fallen. More and more the night air shows us our breath and stings our cheeks and ears. Of an evening, from a neighbor's hearth, the burning of many summers' growth can smell sweet and inviting. We want to warm ourselves there, and to warm ourselves in each other's company. What a good time it is to hear and tell our stories. What story comes to you? Okay, let's come and bring our attention back to here, because now we've come to the time when it's your turn. We can reflect on the themes of this morning's service.
Pass it around. Okay, what happens is when I was in grad school, my friend Bill Nolan, I used to spend a lot of time talking together. He was in physiology. And we would talk literature and stuff. And there was one scientific paper that come to his attention. This was back in 1975, and it was about language. The idea that the authors were saying was that the purpose of language is not to give information, but it is to tell stories.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that happens, why that developed in us, is that, for example, the grown men of the village would go out and hunt a mastodon, and then come back, and everybody would be sitting around the fire, eating their mastodon sticks, and very happy. And the younger boys would say, tell us about the hunt. And what you would do then is it allowed you to live vicariously the experience. And that is the ability that is how we learn. What we do is we do not learn by facts. What we do is we learn quite often just by the imaginings of a storyteller telling us what actually happened. And myths, of course, are just one of those archetypes where the stories have become more and more abstract and express deeper truths. But that's the reason that we have language, is not facts and stories.
The other day, Ivanka said to me, "Do animals have thoughts?" Ivanka asked if animals had thoughts, and I said, "Well, yes, they have thoughts," but she said, "But how? They can't talk." And I kind of struggled to say, well, maybe they think in pictures. But it occurred to me when you were talking is how much more animals, and I think we just instinctively know that they're much more in touch with the natural world. They don't have this continual barrage of static that we think is important information. And they live without that. It just struck me how much closer they are perhaps to reality than we are.
The story that I remember is that, what's it called, Stardust? And how when everything started in the beginning, that everything is related to that initial stardust. So we're all pieces of that initial stardust. And whether it's true or not, or it makes sense, it feels right, so it's a good way to explain how we're all connected.
I think this is timely when we think about stories, that it's almost Thanksgiving, so this is the next time that my whole family will be together. And what I was thinking is, one of the lessons I learned from my father was an appreciation of nature. And at the time of his death, which was 14 years ago, I gave a eulogy, and it was kind of a through the year with my dad. What did he teach us in each season of the year? And the grandkids at that time were not born to 13. And I'm thinking, now they're 14 to 27. Maybe it's time to get out that story of how their grandfather shared, and they may not remember, or they may remember, the beauty of the natural world through the seasons, because it is our ancestors and passing the stories on. And I thank you for making me think about that maybe this is a good time.
I had one more comment too. I went to a conference about a month ago out in California, and I got to participate in a segment that was called a leadership segment, and they had some higher level speakers there. One was a neuroscientist from a college out in California, and he spoke about more like the beginning of your talk, about how our brains actually work and process things, and how we lie to ourselves because our primary function in our brains is that we always want to be right. We always want to think we're right. Like, yeah, sometimes I might be wrong, but right now I'm right. And even when we see images that prove that we're wrong, we think we're right. So the whole brain interaction and how we process things, we don't really understand consciously.
No.
And that separation of conscious versus unconscious, I think maybe makes it more visible to people who are observing, but not necessarily the person.
That was a perfect example. When we were driving by, I asked Mary to take a look at the grounds and say, anything different? She said, I don't see anything different. So nothing was different except the big monument to World War I is gone.
Yeah.
But not to her. To her, nothing was different. It was all the same ones.